was a man who was so taken with all of the miracle accounts that he heard, like in today's account from Mark, that he decided he wanted to find out if there was still a place where one could experience those miracles. So he went on this pursuit around the far corners of the world. And one day he comes across this magnificent village. The setting is perfect. And it seems such a tranquil, quiet place, marked by peace and charity and justice. And he said to himself, this has to be a place where there are miracles. So he goes up to one of the wise older men in the community, and he says, I think I want to live here, but first I have a question. Are there miracles here? Does God work miracles here? And the old man said, well, it all depends on what you understand a miracle to be. Some think a miracle is when God does what people want. Here, we understand a miracle to be when people do what God wants. And if that's the perspective on miracles, in some ways, what we read about St. Paul today as he describes his mission, his, if you will, compulsion, there's a note of miracle there at least as great as the cure of Peter's mother-in-law. Because Paul continues to preach in the face of rejection and danger. And he's not cashing in on what you'd think would be his due. After all, he says, I offer the gospel free of charge so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. In other words, he's not going to accept anything from anybody for doing what he's doing. And yet, on the other hand, he's willing to make himself a slave of all. A way of thinking about that is that Paul moves from obligation to compulsion. It's almost a compulsion for this man. An obligation has been imposed upon me, and woe to me if I do not preach it. A number of years ago, when she was obviously still a very active, Mother Teresa was going through the streets of Calcutta, and a reporter was following along. And finally he stops her and he says, you know, Mother Teresa, I wouldn't do what you're doing for $1 million. To which she responds, nor would I. It's not a bad thing when fulfilling an obligation that comes from God becomes almost a compulsion. And St. Paul will try to get the message of Jesus Christ to all people by trying to become all things for all people, to save at least some. But even more, he recognizes that that message of Jesus Christ is for him too. So he says, all this I do for the sake of the gospel, so that I too may have a share in it. So on one hand, Paul came to believe that through his death and resurrection, Jesus set him free. Peter's mother-in-law recognizes that this Jesus has set her free from her illness. The response of both is to serve. Some of you have been around St. Julie's for a while. Have heard me tell the following story a number of times because it's one of my favorite stories about Abraham Lincoln. And truth be told, it's probably apocryphal. It's probably more of a legend that captures the identity of that man. Well, it turns out that Lincoln, before being elected, as he was in the candidacy to become president, is walking through a small town in the south of the United States. And as he walks toward the main square, he finds that there's a slave auction going on. And what he sees turns his stomach. He finds it repulsive. But his reaction is quite strange, because he draws near and he begins to bid on a young African woman. And as the bidding goes higher and higher, Lincoln keeps bidding higher and higher. And finally, he's the one with the highest bid. So he goes and he pays for this young African woman who is brought before him. And she, trembling with fear and uncertainty as to what will become of her, asks what he intends to do with her. And Lincoln replies, "I intend to set you free." Free? Free for what? She asks. He replies, "Free for whatever you want." And the conversation then continues as she asks, "Well, am I free to go anywhere I want? To do anything I want? To say anything I want? To be anything I want?" And Lincoln replies, "Yes." At which point she says, "Then I want to go with you." Peter's mother-in-law is set free and immediately serves. Paul, recognizing that the gospel he preaches is also for him and that Jesus' death and resurrection has set him free, serves. They both feel compelled because they both are convinced. So, in today's first reading, we have Job. Job, who is besought with all this suffering, has no idea why it is that he who had everything suddenly finds himself sitting on top of a dunghill with everything he ever had taken away, and he himself suffering those sores. And throughout the book of Job, as much as Job cries out for an answer, he never finds one. It's the mystery of God that is the only way that Job can respond to his reality. And so it is for Peter's mother-in-law. So it is for Paul, that their compulsion is not necessarily logical. It's caught up in the mystery of God, of God's will, and that there are things so marvelous as not necessarily to be understood, but to be embraced.